Okay. Dim? Is it okay? Dimmer? Is dimmer okay? Dimmer's great. Okay. All right. Okay. Shall we? Yes. Okay. Good evening. It works? Yeah? Okay. I'm just like, I can't tell. All right. Thank you all for being here in person and online, wherever the camera is, for Reverie of Resistance with Lara Sheehi and Stephen Sheehi. We want to first begin by acknowledging that we are situated in Jojage on the unceded lands of the Ganakanea Nation. Such acknowledgement is in the service of the larger Indigenous struggles for land back, and as such, we stand in solidarity with global Indigenous movements, from the work of the Mohawk Mothers to the liberation of Palestine. My name is Balbir K. Singh, and I am faculty in the Department of Art History, Canada Research Chair in Art and Racial Justice, and the Director of Dark Opacities Lab here at Concordia. Okay, well, that's supposed to be another slide. Sorry, bear with me. There we go. Dark Opacities Lab is a hub of BIPOC political and aesthetic study and strategy. The lab theorizes opacity through the triangulation of race, politics, and aesthetics. From theorizing around redaction to creative trends of color survival strategies, from historicizing visuality, beginning with plantation slavery and interlocking colonialisms, to envisioning abolitionist tools working against carceral technologies. Dark Opacities Lab engages with the evolving terms of opacity to question the easy and extractive logics at play around race and representation, and to reorient around anti-colonial struggles, global anti-racist social movements, and to center the intersectional and internationalist. Additionally, I want to acknowledge my amazing lab research assistants, Temple and Somaya, for holding it down as usual. I also want to shout out this term's first research cluster on the theme of Nazar, who has helped make this work that much richer in conversation, in collaboration, and in spirit. Thank you to Fitsum, Amanda, Marius, Emma, Pratna, and Amitis. And I also want to thank the library tech staff and Mark for making sure a webinar happened. This is the final talk in a series of 3 centering the lab's first 2-year theme, Nazar, a theory of the evil eye. The theme asks, what might it mean to think about surveillance and racist technology using Nazar as an animating framework? If we might understand forms of sight itself as surveillance, as oversight, as a watching that is harmful, that is potentially violent, then what might it mean to consider forms of protection from such sight as necessary, as potentially having its own kind of magic? For Dark Opacities Lab's purposes, Nazar might also consider what it means to situate the psychoanalytics of racism that are embedded in the theory of the evil eye. What is to be coveted? Where does the envy lie? What is rooted in historically? What might be vital to consider given the recent reinvigoration of anti-Muslim sentiment and violence, given its specific rootedness in anti-Palestinian racism? For the lab, this is a chance to explore Nazar as a mode of warding off the evil eye, the violence of the gaze, through the amulet, with what Bell Hooks calls the oppositional gaze, what Ama Ata Aidu named a black-eyed squint, with the possibility of staring back defiantly. Nazar might allow for otherwise theories of repelling the evil eye, the malevolence of the gaze, the structural forms of desire and disgust that compose sight as embedded in structural and systemic and global forms of racism, fascism, and white supremacy. Nazar is as opacity might offer one way to imagine opacity as a political and aesthetic strategy with qualities inexplicable and unconscious that consider the ways we might create other sensory worlds in which to evade racial and colonial capture. Tonight's talk is also co-sponsored by the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Society and Culture's Palestine Interdisciplinary Research Working Group and Academics for Palestine. Special shout out to Norma Rantisi. And now I would like to introduce our esteemed speakers for this evening, Lara Sheehi and Stephen Sheehi. Lara Sheehi is an assistant professor of clinical psychology at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Qatar and a research fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute for Social and Health Sciences. She is the founding faculty director of the Psychoanalysis in the Arab World Lab. Lara's work takes up decolonial and anti-oppressive approaches to psychoanalysis with a focus on liberation struggles in the Global South. She is the co-author with Stephen Sheehi of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, with Routledge in 2022, which won the Middle East Monitor's 2022 Palestine Book Award for Best Academic Book. Lara is the president of the Society for Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Psychology and co-editor of Studies in Gender and Sexuality. Lara is on the advisory board for the USA Palestine Mental Health Network and a member of the founding collective for the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. She's currently working on a new book, which I am extremely excited about, From the Clinic to the Street, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures with Pluto Press. Stephen Sheehi is Sultan Qaboos Professor of Middle East Studies in the Asian and Middle East Studies program. He is the director of the Decolonizing Humanities Project at the College of William and Mary. He teaches in Asian and Middle East Studies, Arabic Studies, and Asian Pacific Islander Studies program. Having published on psychoanalysis, Arab photography, Arab identity, and colonial modernity and Islamophobia and racism, he is most recently the co-author of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine with Lara Sheehi, which won the Palestine Book Award for the best 22 academic book on Palestine, and Camera Palestina, Photography and Displaced Histories, co-authored with Salim Tamari and Issam Nasser, out with UC Press in 2022. He and Nadera Shaloub-Kevorkian most recently co-edited a special issue of State Crime Journal on settler colonialism as state crime, abolitionist perspectives. Both Lara and Stephen's work has transformed psychoanalysis and visual culture, and their collaborative and respective work has made possible new forms and horizons for imagining a more just and liberatory future. Their commitment to Palestine and to the Palestinian people is intellectual, psychic, and deeply felt in their praxis and politics. On a personal note, reading Stephen's work on photography, Arab visual cultures, and Islamophobia over the course of my graduate studies had a major impact on my own book project. And when I read Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, it felt the way that reading Frantz Fanon for the first time did. Completely transformative. It totally shattered my world and remade it anew. The situatedness of the work in grounded material conditions, in Lara's psychoanalytic practice, in the care for the psychic and material lives of her patients, provided a compass for thinking about the ongoing Nakba with such a liveness and what they name the will to live. In many ways, the theme of Nazar relies heavily in their joint work in repositioning psychoanalysis, much in the way that Fanon did. Thank you for that, for getting me to listen to some choice podcasts, and for bringing such energy, fire, and love with you in so many different spaces and in our shared space this evening. With that, I will conclude by thanking you for being with us here in Jojage, Montreal. And the format of today's event will be a talk by Stephen and then Lara. And we will open up questions thereafter, both online and in person. I forgot last time about online. So please, in the webinar, put your questions there as well. And then now, if you could please join me in welcoming Lara Sheehi and Stephen Sheehi.
I thank you, Babir, for such an incredibly moving and meaningful introduction. It's really it's hard to respond to that other than with just great humility and appreciation. And you created such a wonderful space. And I want to thank everyone for coming out. I know it's the end of your year, and you're taking time out of your probably very exhausted lives at this point because it's the end of the semester to be here. And I thank you all. Thank you everyone who made this happen in dark capacities. And it's been wonderful to meet so many of you. Okay, so what we're gonna do is Lara, we're going to sort of read pieces, which I want to say, I'll make a confession that can you all hear me, by the way? Because I've been kind of struggling with what to present today. Um, Over the past several months, Lara and I have done a number of events, and we've sort of rewired them to be more conversational, which we did earlier with Balbir and her students and colleagues. It just feels sometimes kind of weird. When Balbir asked us, we sort of gave her um, some work that was current at the moment, but it's very hard because I read our work. I mean, our work is great. We like it's great. And it's fantastic, but like to think about how our default is the academic register sometimes feels so misattuned and empty. Um, So I have a piece here that I'm reading a part of something that is forthcoming on mourning. It's a part of a larger project, and it comes out of something an earlier thing I did called On Dread of Repair, and the article would be called Palestinian Mourning in Perpetual Genocide. And I just kind of want to, and it's also thinking about, like, I've been wondering about this for several years, but definitely over the past, since the genocide, thinking about the ways in which we hold on to objects in us, how objects organize our um, selfhood, our sanity, our our identifications, and we're told by many theorists like Laura Ballant that we need to let our identifications go, and I think I've always found that to be a particular coming from a particular of I love them. They're fantastic. They're brilliant. But it irritated me because it seemed like an incredibly white thing to say that people who can afford to abandon their objects, which and the way in which you inherited them and who they come from. So I just kind of want you to think about that through in reading this with me. And before I start, I have no idea how long this is going to be. Hopefully, it's going to be under 30 minutes. But I also wanted to start with the image. So this has been stuck with me for the past couple of days. Um, Hilmi al-Faqawi, a journalist, was murdered in a tent by being burned to death a couple of days ago. And with the resumption of I mean, the genocide has been ongoing. We all know since the Nakba, but we understand with the end of the ceasefire and the resumption of this sort of grotesque forms of genocidal violence that the Zionist state is doing. There seems to be like a repetitive thing happening, right? The first thing happens is starvation, cutting off food. The second thing is bombing hospitals, and third thing is mass dispossession, then bombing camps and people in tents, and then burning people alive. So there's like a rhythm of the genocide that's starting to sort of like a redux or a sort of repeat that started with, for example, the image that came up before was Sha'ban al-Dalu, who was 19, who was giving blood and was also burned to death. And there's a famous image of him in his hand reaching out of the fire. I didn't want to use those images. Rather, I just want to credit this to Muhammad Sab'ana, who's a great illustrator in Palestine. He wrote a book called Power Born of Dreams, which also won the Palestine Book Award. Um, and I just kind of want to ground ourselves, and this is the reality in which we're trying to think. So, how do we think about profound and utter sadness at a time where we're also depleted, but also to think about how Palestinians go on and struggle in that, I don't want to say in the shadow, but in the reality and the condition of structural murder, right? These my glasses. These my glasses. On November 21st, 2023, at 9 a.m., Raghida's whole life turned upside down. She says, it turned up on its head. My life had become very difficult. Firstly, in terms of feeling, and that there's nothing more difficult for us than the loss and regret and suffering that we're living. Living near the Islamic University, Raghida Abu Arja was married and pregnant, studying for her master's in computer programming while also working as a programmer with her husband for the Gazan government. She says, my relationship with my family and husband was more than fabulous, despite the conditions of besieged Gaza. She says, the war broke out. The journey of displacement began. Moving from death station to death station, miraculously we escaped. Unquote. With the intensification of bombing, Raghida and her husband left their marital home for her family's house in Rimal. The marital home the next day was destroyed. Only a few days later in Rimal, she, her husband, and her family fled the ground invasion, seeking refuge with her uncle, whose house was in a summer, near a summer roundabout in Gaza City. She says, suddenly, without any warning, the building in which we were refugees that we were living in was bombed. My family and I were under the rubble. There weren't any rescue workers or civil defense or any rescue attempts. A cousin who didn't get trapped in the rubble saved us. He was not able to save everyone. Me, two of my younger sisters, emerged alive. My father, may God have mercy on him, emerged hit and immediately martyred alongside my brother. The next day, my husband pulled out. My husband pulled out. Next day, they pulled out my husband's martyred body, and the third day, my mother and my other brother. Raghida, Raghida narrates a life of terror, sadness, and uncertainty, living with her husband, without her husband, her parents, and her extended family, wishing she had died, wondering about the lives of her family, her family, and her fatherless child, and her two sisters in post-apocalyptic Gaza. There were quote, she says, there were days when my feelings of sadness would multiply, and I felt like dying 100 times. Unquote. Raghida gave birth to a daughter, Lubna, named after her mother. The experience, as Raymond Williams tells us, might be called the structure of feelings of mourning and grief. She says, during childbirth, I was psychologically broken. There was no one to console me. Feelings of motherhood, feelings of joy, even the joy that I should feel was not complete, as all I could do was sob, and sob a lot. I developed a phobia of losing Lubna. I was unable to leave her even momentarily without the fear of losing her. Mixed with emotions of fear and dread and loss, Raghida repeatedly circles back to the importance of the social networks and social relations in Gaza and Palestinian life that are truly targeted by the settler colonial state. She says, God sends people to people. These people alleviate the hardships of us, making things easier for one another. I started to improve little by little in order to care for my daughter. In order to care for my daughter, Lubna, the bearer of my mother's name. Oh Lord, may God have mercy on her. I started to get better for my baby. I started to strengthen myself because the little one needs me. Because my younger sisters need me. They need to be strong. While my fortitude would waver, she said, thinking how she would prefer the quote the honor to have been martyred. Raghida concludes her story with a commitment rooted in the realities of Gaza, the lives of her daughter and sisters, and their future. By the will of God, I will be the mother and father for my daughters and sisters. I will be tired in life, and I will do the impossible. I will do the impossible to live for her to live a better life. My life has ended, but I want to create a life for my daughter and the sisters if God will allow it. Perhaps the most disturbing characteristic of Raghi, the stories, is its quotidian horror. It is a story repeated in 10,000, in tens of testimonials in Akram Musallam's and Abdurrahman Abu Shamali's غزوة تروي إبادتها. Gaza narrates its genocide. The mass character of genocidal suffering, the life in a time of death, as one writer says, invites us to consider how and what and how it is to mourn in a condition of death and sadness, undergirded itself by a commitment to perpetually struggle in defiance for life and liberation. How do we mourn? How do we Arabs mourn in a time of genocide, in a perpetual condition of genocide, a perpetual condition in which we must always struggle for liberation? The question of mourning in such a perpetual condition of genocide amplifies a series of constituent issues that undermine liberal and neoliberal approaches to mourning psychologically or psychologically and ethnographically as an individualized process in tension with melancholia. The two concepts are riveted not only by Freud's famous piece, but because one is considered normative with healthy individuated with when mourning is normative mourning is punctuated by a healthy individuated endpoint, and the other pathologized as a certain forms of stuckness in one's own ego. The discussion itself is mired in concepts of mourning and grieving as perhaps the most individualized experience one can experience. If we are to understand mourning in Palestine and among Arabs so heavily emotionally and socially invested in Palestine, we must understand it inseparable from resistance and the ability to struggle for liberation. That is, mourning and resistance are undergirded by a shared psychic social infrastructure among and between Palestinians under settler colonial apartheid that binds subjects to objects, that organizes particular objects materially, psychically, socially, and culturally in ways that psychically, affectively, and socially cohere individuals internally simultaneously to families and communities. So I'm trying to think about, like, people always talk about like family and networks and all these, but like how does this actually happen, like, psychically and socially, right? How are we bound to our communities and our identities? For the in the first months of the genocide, we learned that parents were writing names of children on their young the names of their children on their young sorry were writing the names of their children on their young limbs so that they would be recognized if they were dismembered by the intense bombing by the Israeli occupation army. The disruption of parent-child relations and the targeting of children and their parents is what Nader Shalhoub Kevorkian calls unchilding, which is actually an intended effect of settler colonial, Zionist settler colonialism. Abdurrahim al-Sheikh registered this advent of horror with the lives and limbs of Palestinian children, where they became a site of writing death and a site of writing life and refusal. Al-Sheikh is a Palestinian scholar whose work dwells in these complex notions of the conflictual biopolitics of Palestinian actually prisoners. He writes as for about this moment. He says, as for the cities of human animals, where bombs of death came down upon hospitals, nurseries, and morgues, Palestinian children write their names in hot ink on their extremities under genocidal wars to make it easier to know who they are and collect their dismembered parts for burial after the explosions and the feast of destruction ends. They would write their names on their hands and thighs to unfathomably meet the will to crawl towards life, the will to walk towards death in Gaza, where both are equal possibilities. For a sheikh, the parents' writing on the limbs of their bodies became a children's writing, where he says, quote, every hand is a witness, every leg is a witness, every body is a cemetery. He narrates for us how bodies of children become a sign of existence where their own life, death, and defiance are coterminous potentials. In the face of genocidal project of total annihilation, death is evident, he says, death is evidence of existence and its condition. I die, therefore I exist. Unquote. In setting Sheikh along with Raghida's story, a profound sense of mourning and dread emerged from the sight of death and life, from the sight of narrating mourning, narrating, writing, and even thinking about them. Rana Barakat reminds us that an engaged intellectual is our quote our ongoing job to remember, to challenge, to disrupt the sequence of time in order in our settler colonial realities, but in doing so to acknowledge the profound and potentially paralyzing sense of sadness, huzn. Death for Palestinian, sorry. The writing of names is a writing of presence, a writing that ensures children will be found, identified, buried, and mourned. Death for Palestinians under settler colonialism is a condition by which they understand that all objects and bodies of themselves are designated for erasure. Writing on bodies anticipates not only death, but as we see, but also the mourning is secured for future remembering, a future for consolidating the lives of Palestinians and within their families that affirm Palestinian life and presence. How am I doing for time? Good. Raghida's narrative conveys a story where clearly her world has been bankrupted of all value because the loss of her husband, mother, father, and brothers, while she expresses her a profound sadness, also emerges signs of self-loathing and sort of self-retribution. Gazan parents write on their children's limbs alongside Raghida's experience suggests how gendered bodies and social reproduction become the unspoken material base through which genocide is fully expressed, through the targeting and extermination of pregnant women, mothers, infants, children, and adolescents. Nadir Shalhoub Kevorkian also shows us specifically the gendered dimensions of Zionist settler colonial targeting of mothers, children's, fathers, and their relationship between them in order to degrade and eliminate social relations essential to what she calls Palestinian livability. Palestine Feminist Collective statements protesting the conditions of reproductive genocide, which they call reproductive genocide, inflicted by the Zionist army on the Palestinians, names not only starvation, destruction of healthcare, and ethnic cleansing, but also, quote, gendered and sexual violence of women and girls, and gendered and sexual violence of men and boys by the occupying state force. Sorry. And they just want to, they don't go on to note, actually, I'm just looking here, it says they go on to note that something like during the first months of the occupation, the UN reported that um, the occupation army were murdering 2 mothers an hour. The objects in Palestinian social sort of formations that form like the bond of like Palestinian identity are the material lives of family members, lovers, and friends that will not be returned. Likewise, these lost objects may be marital family homes, like or lives or professions, like Raghida's were destroyed, like her jobs were lost, like her education was destroyed, right? Her hopes and dreams were cut short, she says. When we speak of objects, therefore, we are considering the persons and things to which we psychically are attached and affectively invest and libidinally connect. In classic psychoanalysis, objects are understood exclusively within a psychic economy of the individual. Yet Palestine continues to offer lessons to inquire into how objects sustained oppressed peoples, despite being deliberate or because they're deliberate targets of systematized and unrelenting reproductive genocide. I'm just skipping a piece here. The power of mourning is the power of social and psychic is the power of the social and psychic relations of the occupied and colonized, a constellation of objects and subjects in relation to one another that ensures Palestinian individuals, family members, and communal cohesion to have cohesion. Mourning for Palestinians then, even individually, defies the Israeli state along with non-state apparatuses in actively seeking to build structures to dismember them. As Lara and I have written before, contemplating the parents' writing of names of living children, of the living on the children's body, um, we think of this as a way of marking the body not only as potential spaces of death, spaces of preemptive, but also spaces of preemptive mourning and anticipatory grief, but also, quote, this stealing of Arabic letters, as Sheikh says, the stealing of Arabic letters is a practice of meaning making within a grammar of resistance. This orthography of refusal elevates their young bodies as sites that reproduce social meaning to shore up objects of identification under settler colonialism and state-sponsored and organized program of genocidal erasure. A sheikh writes, a sheikh's writing is a tribute to the parents and children of Gaza, but it's also to a defiant mode against elimination. He writes, the children of Gaza are masters of absence, despite the fear of treachery of the unseen, unquote. This courage comes from the social and interpsychic bonds between parents and children to stave off the suffocating conditions of settler colonial occupation and apartheid. The psychic dimensions of these bonds, considering what is being written on their limbs, manifested in a living space, demarcated by the ever certainty of murderous death, namely the carrying of messages between parents and children, between the dead and the living, and between the present and the future. I have to say, I'm trying to think of this. I'm kind of like I don't want to like fucking over intellectualize, but this is maybe important. The issue of mourning demands us to think not of a state of loss, but a state of presence that was lost but persists and is metabolized through messages that have been already relayed between parent and child. In other words, we speak of loss, but a residual of the object remains not lodged in the ego, but lodged in something exterior to it, lodged in that becomes a guide to the social. This residual is what Christopher Bolus calls the unthought known. The unthought known are messages of knowledge of a traumatic material in a world that passes between the child and their object, i.e., their parent. And the unthought known is the information passed as the social object into the individual. And the parent absorbs this confusing, overwhelming message and content. In doing so, contains and holds the child. So you can think about this is the way the child contains the scary world in which they live in, and then pass it to the parent, and the parent holds that to keep them safe, right? The parent, namely the gendered figure of the mother. And I have a little, and when I wanted to think about the gendered mother of the figure, really not in deterministic terms, obviously, as a sort of a positionality that can be occupied, right? Not one that's biologically determined, right? The parent, namely the gendered figure of the mother, holds and contains not only the child, but also the objects around which the subject or the child emerges in relation, even before knowing them. This opening of a psychic space is what Wilfred Bion calls reverie. Palestine offers us again more lessons to psychoanalysis, but our ability to remain, but in particular, our ability to remain sane in the face of genocidal onslaught and remain committed to revolution. Like, so how do you fucking not get overwhelmed? Basically, I'm thinking about, right? Right? And the Palestinians show us how objects are lost, but also how they may survive, and how they're products of a powerful psychosocial relations that bind Palestinian communities, social relations, and the objects that are forged and galvanized through decades of creating a culture of resistance that defies the eliminatory logic of settler colonial violence and Zionism. Raghida's narrative is grounded in this gendered positionality as wife, sister, daughter, niece, mother. In her profound sadness, she admittedly says, she was, quote, admittedly, quote, psychologically broken, she says. But in moving from the position of wife, daughter, and sister, cared for, held, and nurtured by others, right? She assumes the social and interpersonal role of that mother and older sister and surrogate mother. She assumes the need for care for her. She sees the need for her to care for, love, and guide and hold her younger sisters and her new daughter Lubna in order for them to live in a world that will outlive genocide. Raghida moves to dynamically contain and metabolize the world for her sisters and Lubna, holding the terror of a world, holding the terror of a world that intends to destroy them, but also in doing so creates the good object or recreates the good object of her mother, her father, her cousins, her grandmother, who she speaks about, that ensures a liberated future. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and sorry over here, I'm not going to be able to to see you. Thank you. I haven't heard this, so I heard it with you first. And I'm sort of full with the affect, and I kind of want us to sit with that too. That part of the disconnect sometimes in these academic spaces is the demand is that affect is not here with us, and that's like how academia is done, right? That we're like serious people and we can think about these things. But I think part of the provocation is that how do we understand affect as always being there and actually a guide? And so as I lead into mine, I'm just thinking about um, this sentence that to how do we live in a world that outlives genocide, right? And that's the like if we're going to hold that with the affect, how do we live in a world that outlives genocide? um, and do this counterintuitive thing that you're sort of laying out for us, that Stephen's laying out for us, of like, it's so predetermined what mourning and loss looks like, and it's not to take that away, but it's to say, how do we maintain that through that? There's also still a future that's involved, and I think this is where as we pivot into this, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I've been thinking a lot about psychic militancy and our ability to do that and how it relies to do this counterintuitive work relies on us being able to remain clear despite the affect that's actually really important and the utter violence and the tragedy that we carry with us always. It's not to forget that. It's not to forget that there are real that these kids we're talking about that are not just numbers anymore when their names are written on them, but that these kids were murdered too, right? It's not like this is not about us valorizing or sort of romanticizing that, but saying, is there a counterintuitive reading to this that actually is about outliving the genocide, right? So that's how I'm thinking about um, my piece. So let me just frame it quickly, and then I'll go into it. So as a psychoanalytically oriented clinical psychologist, I'm interested in the way psychic resistance buoys us in against ever increasing oppressive conditions. I've been thinking obsessively about this since the genocide began. I've been thinking about it before, but it feels so urgent. As a Lebanese Arab, this interest takes on a personal dimension. So oppressive conditions are not just abstractions in Lebanon, and certainly not in Palestine or in Yemen or in Syria or in Iraq or Sudan, and even in our shared settler colonies, right? Whether it's the United States or the state now known as Canada. In the context of Lebanon, I'm thinking about the decades-long condition of settler colonialism and the imperialism that shores it up that we share with Palestine. This interstice is the place where my family has become political refugees multiple times in my lifetime. This is how I come to hold captive Canadian citizenship. That was the first place of political refuge, where the south of Lebanon is fantasized as separate, made to pay the price for militant refusal, where sectarianism and anti-Shia racism deflects from the settler colonial condition with ease. It's also the place where Palestinian and Lebanese resistance have locked arms, refusing to have their or our fight be atomized. Since Al Aqsa flood, as I'm saying, I've been studying what it means to engage in a practice of psychic militancy, to remain militant in clarity with increasing fervor. I've been interested in how remaining aligned in psychic militancy is a challenge, right? It's hard to do that. It's hard to think about the kids as a site of life, not just death, when we actually see kids being dismembered, right? Um, it's a challenge, and more importantly, focused on distilling the mechanics of such militancy so that we can use it and read how settler colonial logics and their imperialist counterparts work to lodge themselves inside of us. Part of why it's so hard is because it comes to live inside of us, and it becomes very difficult to do this. So how is it that we can refuse psychic intrusions and their politically demobilizing work? Because the point of that psychic intrusion that doesn't allow us to do this work is to demobilize our political commitments. So I've been concerned with the province of the psyche as a pointed target of Zionist violence and imperialist expansion, right? It's not by accident. It's a province that's intended to be intruded upon seamlessly, exploited to speed along political demobilization through the activation of confusion, fear, and despair. I use Frantz Fanon, of course, and I've begun to think about how the psychopolitical affective work of these violent systems impress on our psyches. They insist on being felt, yes, but also on becoming normative fixtures within the topography of our external worlds, right? So this becomes, the image that we're seeing becomes like a normative thing that happens, but also in our internal worlds. And that's the part that it becomes a normative. It wants to fix itself as like, this is the way that we feel and sort of think and process. The task has felt increasingly urgent to me, as you can imagine, and never more so than in the moment in which the full swing of imperialist and settler colonial forces collide in the so-called Middle East to usher in the new version of their imperial fantasies. There's an even more raw texture, and I've heard this spoken to a lot, than when the question of Syria and Yemen is introduced. These are questions that have always been central in the matrix of colonial power and imperial domination of our region, of course, but they're disappeared, right? So then the question of Palestine somehow is disconnected from the question of Syria or of Yemen. And that dislocation is actually the condition that created such dehumanizing recklessness to begin with. And it's a political affective creation into which we're psychically seduced, right? The separation of these things. This disappearance, this displacement, both psychically and literally, is where our psychic militancy is most pressing. It's where we continue to psychically resist, so the attempts to reconfigure both our external topography doesn't transpose itself into our internal world with the well-oiled ease on which systems of oppression rely, right? If the outside world is reconfigured, that the reliance is actually, it'll be internalized internally, and then all the pressures of that come with it. So here's kind of where I arrived at the psychic militancy. I said this a little earlier in the workshop that we were doing, but I want to sort of locate it in Frantz Fanon's work. In a 1950 essay in Al Mujahid, 1957, by the way, right? In Al Mujahid, the newspaper for the National Liberation Front of Algeria, Frantz Fanon reminds us that liberation is the precondition. He writes in response to critics of the FLN, whom he says insist on reason and negotiations as strategic starting points. It's familiar to us, right? This is 1957 he's writing. To this supposedly strategic negotiation, he responds, quote, abandoning the preconditions and the goals of our struggle are one and the same thing. The FLN will not betray the trust of the Algerian people in order to conform with some goodwills unconnected with the horrendous real that is the martyrdom of our homeland. Nothing solid or constructive can be elaborated on lies and duplicity, right? Nothing solid or constructive can be elaborated on lies and duplicity, end quote. Fanon articulates a central guiding process for us all. Abandoning the preconditions psychically is an assurance that it will be abandoned materially. The starting point psychically, the possibility that we could forget that the starting point is liberation. It feels so easy. But for us to stay there, once we abandon that psychically, the material abandonment comes right after. So the psychic precursor becomes the condition through which possibilities of liberation and capitulation or normalization are articulated and eventually enacted. Liberation as the precondition may be seen as an obvious statement for any one of us who are committed to revolution, and yet the coercive and seductive ideological processes which these structures exact their impact make maintaining psychic militancy grounded in the starting point exponentially difficult, right? This is precisely where we must attune to the imperious intrusions that happen on us. So many people would reach out to me, especially throughout this, continuously so, and say, I feel like I'm going crazy. Even though we see images like this is a real person, it's not a cartoon, right? Folks feel like they're going crazy. And that's the piece where I'm like, okay, there's something happening here. Those are intrusions. And then we can recognize that as the expansionist project of Zionism and imperialism. It cannot be complete without the theft of the terrain of the psychic as well, right? For example, this is one concrete way we can do this. We can become conscious of the ways in which settler colonial reality bending that Stephen and I talk about in the book activates our psychic world along well-worn affective planes and circuits by causing us to have associative processes. These are the things that are already, they tie in with ideology that's already present, and it happens quickly and we don't even notice it's happening. On the simplest level, these processes appear to signal to us who we are to fear. Okay? Resistance fighters and sneakers or shahatat, those are the people we're supposed to fear, versus armored genocidal soldiers, right? Despite the fact that there are tanks, right? Those associative processes are already at play, and that's what we're sort of the psychic inversion that happens. On a more sophisticated level, settler colonial reality bending may have us etching a history of our region before it has even happened, right? That's the psychic capitulation before. Seemingly convinced and lured into a psychic fait accompli of the oppressor's victory, this is where the commodified despair that stabilizes the colonizing force. It's a psychic implant. The fait accompli, the history that hasn't even happened, is always one that we're already preparing for, right? And it's the fullest expression of liberatory foreclosures. The second we decide this history has already happened, we give up we basically assure that that's going to be the material thing that happens. Resisting psychic imperialism then, or colonization, must begin with locating ourselves at an uncompromising baseline of total liberation for our region, a liberation that must run through Al-Quds, Jerusalem. This unbending starting point is not Pollyannish, but rather grounds us, as Walter Rodney has said, while also disrupting attempts to decenter our struggle politically and psychically from that baseline. Again, the starting point, the precondition is liberation. Psychically, it's very important to always go back to that because it generates political affective energies of material possibilities beyond that which recalibrates power. It's a fierce counterforce that heeds Fanon's warning. This is his words. Nothing solid or constructive can be elaborated on lies and duplicity. If that's our starting point, then nothing materially good can happen. But if our starting point, the precondition is liberation, there are possibilities that can emerge from that. In this way, psychic clarity shores up our disciplined commitment to psychic militancy. We practice how to stave off confusion and the never-ending terror that is both the intention and consequence of Zionist aggression, expansionism, and imperial violence. Learning to read, identify, and detect the psychopolitical affective with the precision of militant clarity, especially after more than a year and a half of unadulterated genocide and settler and imperial expansionism, becomes a crucial skill and one that can be internalized through repetition. Right? In this decisive moment of liberal enticements and global capital's restabilization, it becomes essential to maintain militant clarity and reground ourselves in the skill as a starting point. Right? And if you see, if I'm repeating, it's because this is the practice. We have to repeat. The starting liberation is the precondition. It becomes a repetitive force that we have to keep saying to internalize it psychically, affectively, materially, and politically, just as fiercely as the murderous repetition compulsion of settler state violence compels us to repeatedly return to the position of psychic militancy, right? The counterforce has to be as strong and consistent and persistent as the force of the state and settler colonial violence. So I'm going to shift a little bit to the region and those of us from the region, those of us who do work on that or have followed it, to the slogan, Al-Shab yurid isqat al-Nizam. Okay? Translated literally, the infamous slogan and chant utilized across the Arab world communicates a simple yet profound call. Al-Shab yurid isqat al-Nizam. The people desire the fall of the regime. Taken more contextually, it communicates an active versus passive demand. The people will overthrow the or all regimes. Regimes will not just come tumbling down. Rather, we will forcefully make it happen, and we will not rest until it transpires. The active versus passive delineation is not a pedantic point, but remember, if we go back to the psychic position, it sets the frame for a psychic orientation that can stand to be pressed upon in service of liberation versus reactionary capture, right? So if we can think about it as an active demand that demands us to actually engage in it, the psychic position is the precondition is liberation, right? In this push to reclaim an active resistance against psychopolitical affective intrusion, we position ourselves to psychically reorganize our struggle. It demands something active of us to reorganize what our struggle is, a struggle that, to crib Amilcar Cabral, can claim no easy victories. This is not an easy task. A struggle that must reject any static accomplishment, which we have seen countless times before. We can quickly transform into a foreclosed endpoint, right? This is an active and perpetual moving liberatory process. Just like the psychic world, if we're thinking about the unconscious as not having, any time or direction or endpoint, we have to reconfigure the ways we're also thinking about this. So an active commitment to the fall of a regime or all regimes and borders and nation states can instead be understood as maintaining a movement that hinges on a perpetual antagonism that repetitiously ignites dynamic transformation, right? So this commitment is, again, one of the things of coming back over and over and over again, repeating to ourselves, to each other in movement and in our movements too. So said more simply, الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام transmutes into one of many practices of psychic militancy, one that remains aligned with Fanon's precondition of Cabral's brutal honesty and the sustained pressure needed to ward off normalization of a settler colonial framing that insists that we have suffered an a priori loss, that we've already lost, right? This psychic framing insists that the struggle continues and must be predicated on settler and imperial failures. Okay, it's settler and imperial failures, both in the present and the future, not ours. Right? They will fail, not us. Likewise, it's predicated on accurately naming that settler and imperial successes, anything that the state has won, the murdering of children, the dismembering of them, the burning of people alive, all these successes have been stolen, strong-armed, or battering rammed into existence. Accurately naming these successes as triumphs of murderous force versus constitutive upper hand and strategy or militaristic acumen is actually really important. It upends the racist logic that animates an Orientalist so-called dependency complex that Fanon also talked about. It also insists on a reality testing exercise. I'm sort of walking us through what does it mean to have militant clarity, right? They have not succeeded. It tells us that the reality testing exercise against the insistence of settler colonial reality bending that would have us disavow who and what galvanizes that force with impunity. It's the settler colonial state that murders. That is not a success. That is because they have access through other settler colonies to force with impunity, right? In this necessary repetition, as continuous and persistent as the intrusion itself, we also remind ourselves that the deployment of a pragmatist realpolitik can also stage a psychic mapping of possibilities and therefore, more importantly, ensure impossibilities that go on to shape how we psychically attune to or away from our liberation. So away from the reconfiguration of our psychic struggle, we feel compelled, seduced, that's another word, we're seduced, conscripted, into making psychic choices that work to only stabilize normative structures and then reinscribe settler colonial imperial possibilities of their futures. When we start from the position of they're winning, they're stronger than us, they have all of that, that is an insistence on their futures, their successes, right? For example, rather than a psychic rearticulation of al-Shab yurid isqat al-Nizam, we come in our region to said here the tired psychic turned material traps that are often foisted upon us. In the case of our region again, imperial collusion or Arab necro-capitalist Dama. Those are the only choices we have, right? That's the trap, that's a psychic trap that I'm sort of trying to bring us into. In the settler colonies, other compromises that rely on state capture or legibility through state processes are always already stacked against us. And that's the point that Fanon's sort of bringing us into, is that we have to begin with liberation as the starting point, right? And that sort of gets us out of the trap, that binary trap that we either do this or we do this, or we're always, again, the fait accompli history. This is the sort of last part here. My study of psychic militancy should not be mistaken for reactionary New Age endorsement that posits that we can think or manifest our way out of material conditions, not of our making. I have to say this, okay? I'm not sort of like, let's sort of bring this in. To the contrary, that's the point. The point of me saying that it is very hard to do what Stephen was laying out for us is precisely that. We can't just manifest our way out of kids being dismembered, right? But it does, the reorienting ourselves psychically is a starting point that has to happen so that we're not brought back into the sort of inevitability of their successes, right? Rather, psychic militancy insists on a sharpening of our psychic focus, a psychological methodological tool articulated by Palestinian political prisoner and martyr Walid Daqa, a methodological tool to resist psychic intrusions and protrusions that dictate what come to be understood as normative fixtures of our reality politically, socially, and relationally. We're constantly having to remind ourselves that these are not organic structures, they're not normative, right? That is, psychic militancy is a practice in which we repeatedly affirm that the mechanism of psychic carceral discipline is always at work, right? And that this mode of carcerality is necessary for the sustenance of the material conditions that are not of our making. That carcerality is necessary for this to happen, right? Our psychic investments, conscious or unconscious, in a reality forged by imperial force and settler colonial plunder, is but one of many ways in which we're conscripted to stabilize oppressive structures. Said more directly, in limiting what we consider possible and impossible, we work along well-worn foreclosed junctures that shore up the imperious surety of settler and imperial futures, right? That us sort of believing the lie makes it more sure that their future will continue and that we can't live in a world that outlives genocide. Okay? Just a reminder to us, there's always a pragmatist or realpolitik argument against freedom dreaming, if I'm borrowing here from R.D.G. Kelly, Robin D.G. Kelly. An argument that often devolves into accusations of fantastical presumptions of the future when the present demands our practical engagement, right? This sounds great. Yeah, we need to now be engaged, stop dreaming about the future. This is what we often hear, right? But the pragmatist approach often misses that A, freedom dreaming does not disentangle itself from practical engagement, right? That's one of the traps that we fall into. B, the psychopolitical affective processes are always at work. Right? That's the part that it misses. And as Fanon warned, the reasonable choice is one already saturated by coercive psychic compromise away from the precondition. So that impossible choice is already one that's been made impossible by a condition that already exists. While the realpolitik argument is then always over-invested in the delusion in which freedom dreaming may be engaged, it has already psychically surrendered emergent possibilities. So when we move away from freedom dreaming, we've already done something psychically, right? We've foreclosed possibilities that might come into being. This is how psychic carceral discipline works, matching the external chokeholds that Jasper Puar contours with the foreclosures of dynamic movement in our interiority, inside ourselves, in our psychic space, in our minds. Psychic carceral discipline is where Isqat al-Nizam in Surya, for example, induces a psychic collapse, one that determinatively prunes dynamic possibilities into fixed potentials, what could potentially happen. Within the practice of psychic militancy, Isqat al-Nizam of a murderous 50-year regime, for example, is cause for joy that itself should return us to the precondition rather than distract from it. Right? This clarity moves us away from imperial and settler interventionism of any kind. That both of those can be true, right? That one does not mean that we're now, yes, yay, the United States is here and it's going to be our savior, right, around this. In psychic militancy, we relieve ourselves of psychic seductions that rely on revisionist histories, as well as the imperial washing of our movements in our region and here, of course. We engage in a militant practice against psychic imperialism. Okay, let me do this. I'm almost done, Belbear. Here, this is space making and placeholding. Okay, so Black feminist queer psychoanalyst Gail Lewis works and lives through the prism of Black feminisms to imagine possibilities of political coalition building that are not hamstrung by neoliberal articulations of identity, space, and place. This is an example of psychic militancy. In her recent article in Whose Movement Is It Anyway? Intergenerationality and the Problem of Political Alliance, she reminds us that our political project ideally, quote, articulates a need to evaluate shifts in visions and priorities in the light of complex, intertwining ideological, material, psychic, local, national, and global conditions, right? Just a small task for us, right, to hold all of that in mind. She calls this space making and place holding, what is called, quote, disruptions to the orthodoxies through which racialized people have been named and made intelligible in the logics of governance and regulation by state institutions and media alike. The foreclosures, right? Those are the positions we're always going to take up. We can think of psychic militancy as a central part of space making and place holding, a psychic counterforce to a theological framing, instead insisting on a truth telling about the very processes that brought about the violent condition, right? A truth telling of what makes it possible that a journalist can be burned alive, right? This isn't a natural extension of warfare, right? So it's a militancy to tell the truth about the force, and for us also to retain the clarity to be able to say that. In animating the psychic importance of emergent possibilities, we can psychically resist falling in line with foreclosures of the pragmatic or the savior brand, right? And here I was thinking through this from play therapy, or any therapy really. And imagine this practice as a version of radical play. It's not merely when we do therapy with folks, whether it's kids or adults, doing the therapy is not merely a fantastical displacement of material reality. I mean, for some therapists it is, but for me it's not, right? But it's an affective, relational, and political practice of modes of being and doing in the world. Otherwise, to borrow from Feluke Taylor. In this practice, just as in play therapy or other therapies, possibilities are worked out. They're reworked, they're done and redone, they're repeated over and over and over again, precisely to forge new possibilities of relationality and the reality in which it resides, as much now as in the future. It's not always about looking, it's right now we're also doing this. Because this process is dynamic, it necessarily includes possibilities we cannot bring into consciousness in this moment. That's what a therapeutic process has helped me think about, that we can't see the possibilities. These possibilities themselves emerge through the process of engagement, but they can't do that if we're not starting from a place of the precondition, that liberation is our precondition. We've witnessed these types of possibilities with acuity in the past year, especially if we think about the student intifada and what the possibilities that came into being. We couldn't have even anticipated this, especially and even across the globe. It's important to name these as the emergent possibilities and remember that state violence, abduction, and disappearance is the solid norm in settler and imperial conditions, not in the sort of worlds we're thinking about. And here I will end with the possibilities that could emerge are yet to be known, right? As important of an acknowledgement in our psychic militancy, we do not yet know the possibilities that could come into being, so that we're able to divest from all modes of functioning that fix us into a history that hasn't yet happened, right? When we sort of talk about things in terms as though they've already happened, again, we're psychically fixing ourselves into that place. So psychic militancy makes it such that all possibilities remain viable and dynamic, precisely because they emerge from the knowledge that imperial violence and Zionist settler colonialism seek to invade the psychic as readily as our geographic territories. Thank you so much.
All right. So thank you again to Stephen and Lara for such brilliant talks. I would like to open it up for Q&A, and take questions from the audience. I'll do like 2 or 3 at a time, and then I will also check in online to see what is up there with the Q&A. But if there are folks, I will just sort of, yeah, here. Yeah, for the webinar purpose.
Sorry, I didn't wear a mask. I would have, yeah, sorry. Hi, my name's Hiba أجدادي من سوريا من دمشق لاذقية من بيروت من Haifa. And I like introducing myself that way, pre-colonial borders, because that's the way it feels to me. And I'm a therapist. I work with queer, trans, racialized, primarily Arab folks here in Jojage in Montreal. And my musing for you to bounce off, it's not really a question. So I recently reread Fanon, Black Skin, White Masks, and I tripped across a paper by, sorry, I'm going to be a little intellectual because it's my coping along with depersonalization, because anyways, I'll just be clear. And I came across a paper by Derek Hook called Death-Bound Subjectivity, where he explores a death drive, not in a Freudian sense, but in an ethical sense, that for those of us that live in societies and structures where our deaths are a normalized, expected, legitimized feature of those societies, then our subjectivity is death-bound, and that in that there is a liberation. Joanna Hedfa, who's a critical disability person, would say that doom is our starting point for liberation. And I like the way he describes this very densely. I had to read it 3 times, as an attachment to a process, not an outcome. And I hear that a lot in what you're saying in terms of, yes, the abstraction of a liberation as an outcome, but what could that liberation look like? How do we get there? That we leave the space open for different possibilities. So just my thinking about especially this very modernist attachment to outcome, what is success, what is an end point, the end of the journey, versus a more transgenerational, no end point kind of attachment to the principle or the process. And I'm just wondering any thoughts you might have on that to help my learning. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, and thanks, Stephen, for citing PFC and the reproductive genocide statement. This is like a question, or maybe also amusing for both of you. So in what we were trying to communicate in that statement is that what Palestinians are doing, and again, like that, the act of mothering transcends like the assigned gender or of the person, but what they are doing essentially is creating life in conditions of unlivability. And because like this is literally the condition of possibility of Zionism, is the complete and total obliteration of Palestinian life. And that includes the infrastructure that sustains life, like hospitals and water sources and so on. And then also just like thinking about Lara, your intervention about liberation as the precondition and creating the conditions to live here, to like as the racialized people who are in exile, refugees on Turtle Island, and taking that to the site, to like the university as a site of struggle. How do we, like, I want to hear your thoughts about making liberation the precondition here in the academy and not spending so much time thinking about it, but really doing it, because like you said, it's not a natural extension of warfare that we're seeing our people being burnt alive and our lands being annihilated. It's also not a natural extension of academy that our universities are funding the weapons that are burning our people alive. And our role is to think, but also to do. And so I want to hear your thoughts about that.
One more and then I'll.
So I want to say that your work has been incredibly helpful to me personally, both of you. Um, I have a few ideas. I don't know if they'll congeal, but I've been naming something. I call it the flickering. And it is like, because I have cousins who are still in the West Bank, and there was a new baby born just a few weeks ago. And the flickering is between imagining his life and imagining his death, and this the flickering between um, already mourning and not wanting to succumb to that, but also the pain of the hope or the future, the dreaming of wanting to go and meet him and someday be there. And I'm really struck by, I really appreciate your refusal to romanticize anything, because I find like a romanticization of the past or an over focus on fighting erasure of a past. Like I just feel like some people succumb to that in a kind of romantic way, as if we've already lost, as if it's already complete, as if our jobs are to document a people gone, you know? And I really struggle with that because I see people in the diaspora, I don't know, I feel like they do things like that in order to fight the erasure of past. But it always leaves me feeling disempowered to feel that way. And so finally, this is something you said in another talk that I heard somewhere. You said like being at a distance does not mean being dislocated from the land. I'd love to hear more about that. Because it's another idea that it's like this burgeoning thing, like this opening of possibilities not yet there yet.
Okay. I'm seeing there's a thread about the precondition um here. So let me sort of work backwards, like the as an example, the distance, like being in diaspora for me is not sort of dislocated from the land itself, particularly Palestine or Lebanon or any of the struggles. I think this is a great example of the precondition being liberation, because I think sometimes that doesn't mean the fights aren't different. They're very different, right? We're not saying we're fighting the same fight that people on the ground are fighting, whether it's in Lebanon or Palestine or Yemen or anything like this. But the return to the precondition is one that always reminds us why people are in diaspora to begin with, right? That return, like people aren't allowed to go back because a settler colonial regime has insisted that there is no right to return. And that is the return to the precondition always psychically, that we're not sort of just getting wrapped up in, I'm in diaspora, therefore I can't fight the same fight, and who am I to do this? And like that myth of diaspora is one that was created by a settler colonial regime that is intent on the erasure, and like that this is a logical extension, that people just sort of leave their lands and never go back and all. And then there's something very important, particularly about Palestine, to like rename it constantly and say the dislocation is one that was born out of a genocidal settler colonial regime. That's not us also denying that some people decide to leave and perhaps we're settlers in another state. That's always been a possibility. But to say that we're in diaspora because we choose to be is also not a sort of there's not a truth telling that comes with that. And I think that's the practice of a return to the precondition, that it's liberation, and it's a liberation that will allow us, and liberation that will allow us to return to our lands, right? And to Hiba's point of like free borders between our lands also. It's not an also going backwards and sort of saying we want to go back to the times or this. That is a reverse sort of settler time that says the chronology, like somehow liberation means we go back to those times. That's not what we're talking about either. It is again, a militant position in which we hold. So to Hiba's point about the relationship to death and life, yes, those of us who've been under sort of settler colonial regimes understand, and the sort of First Nation people, indigenous peoples of this land have the same sort of thing. And we can think about it through health statistics or suicide statistics or whatever way we want to, that the state sort of imagines this. But the bottom line is that the relationship and the proximity to life and death is what determines that. At any moment, like Stephen was saying, the potential for life and death is always there, is the way that we can think about that. The return to the precondition is being clear on what caused that. It's not it's not like biologically determined that those of us who are colonial subjects have a different relationship to life and death. It's always a naming and a returning to the forces that would make a hierarchical relationship to life and death between different peoples, right? And that's the persistence of that truth telling and the reading the logic of that, right? The positionality is not one that is organic or natural or somehow inevitable. That's, I think, what we're trying to get at, is that there is an overdetermined reading of these things where we can, and maybe you can talk more about this in terms of the writing on the bodies as a death of life, as a space of life, not just death. But it is so easy for us to overdetermine that space. And I think part of what we're trying to sort of collectively flesh out is that these are all contested sites. And when we think about them or relate to them, even psychologically or emotionally, as predetermined and fixed, that's when we move away from the precondition of liberation. So to your question about the university being the site of that, right, and to remain clear on that, in the site of the university, it's that for me, right? It's how do we sort of continuously push up against and make these spaces contested spaces, not spaces of compromise. Refusals are a part of that, because the language of the university, the language of like, well, just come in and talk to the administration and do that. I think we were talking about earlier that even thinking about a version in which the university could have not been a site of antagonism is where we fall into this trap. The structure of the university will always be a structure of antagonism against liberation. And us, instead of psychically orienting to how can we fix the space for it to become the space of, is sort of saying how can we continuously be in antagonism towards the configuration of the university, just like we're antagonism to the configuration of the settler colony, to imperialism, to all of that, right? But again, it's a practice, and that's why I use the repetition even in speaking, because I think sometimes we're like, oh, but we're just saying this over again, the same thing over again. It's like that's precisely the point, right?
Know how much I can add. Frankly, I think that was a good place to end. I would just want to point to sort of the thing that the sort of the common theme that was also undergirding these three wonderful comments. If Lara talks about the precondition, what you were talking about is the condition. And I would just want to think about the condition of the flickering is not a condition of you like being like in a film, right, where you have like sliding doors or something like bring, bring, bring. No, it's the condition where that is a simultaneous condition at all time, right? As Lara was saying, where death and life walk in hand and are actually galvanized together at any particular moment. That is the colonial condition, and that's the condition of the colonized. When we think that, so in other words, another way to reframe it in terms of the settler colony now known as the United States is anytime a black person might get in a car, they might die. They might get to their destination, but they also might die. That is the condition of the marginalized. How about you kind of describe what could be called a necropolitical condition? I wouldn't look to Derek Hook for that guidance. I think um, uh, I'm not going to dig into it, but what I think it, because precisely for the way I think that when we think about process, I mean, he's not the person to talk about process over output. That's like a long-standing feminist and decolonial feminist methodology, which he may or may not have acknowledged. But to think about, it's also, to stop thinking about endpoints, he says, or maybe say, but there is that doesn't mean that we don't think about places to go and we don't get lost in process. Because, and this is what I mean, I want us to think really about the endpoint. You can think the endpoint is liberation. What Lara is saying is that the liberation is the precondition, which is a difference, right? But what I also want to say is the condition is not the same condition for everybody. We don't all live in the same world, right? So what I'm trying to think through, definitely in the morning piece, but ever like, what is it when we're just seeing this now, like all the liberals are running around with chickens without heads in the United States. Oh my God, we don't have rights, and oh my God, the just constitution. Like, welcome to the fucking world of a Palestinian, or someone living in a favela, or someone living in a mine in South Africa, right? Like, what is it to live in a world where you don't inhabit the same space in the same way? So what we're all sort of talking about is the condition, let's call it, of coloniality, in which you have this sort of coterminous possibilities of life and death, but then also how does that then compel us to think in a revolutionary way, in sort of the ways that Lara is talking about, and thinking about, like, it's recognizing that condition, then allows us to articulate the precondition, right? Because Trump isn't thinking about the precondition of liberation, right? The people who are thinking about the precondition of liberation are the people who have disalienated awareness of the conditions of life and death in which they simultaneously hold. I don't know if that's too abstract. I work very much to intellectualization, which is why I try to fight back. So I fight myself.
Hi, thanks, Lara. Stephen. It's not so much that I rarely have questions at these. It's like more like constellations of starbursts of thoughts in my head. And I want to sort of pause and reflect on something about the way that like psychic militancy actually operates from the place of like life affirming. So the precondition as life affirming, because the way that settler colonialism and colonial like logics of place, space, and mind function is through death and destruction and extraction. And there's something about that in itself, the settler colonial regime cannot exist without explicitly locating itself with death. Indigenous ontologies and epistemologies show us and tell us pre-models of how life affirming is actually the only way to imagine through what is the most unfathomable, the most unbearable, the ungrievable. And so existing knowingly, and I'm speaking to the context specifically drawing on like indigenous scholarship and the traditions in the context of settler US, settler Canada, Kanaka really thinking through that, like, part of that psychic relief from apathy. And I think Lara, I was telling you this on Saturday night, like the biggest enemy that we have to combat, on one hand, we want to hold space for grief and mourning, but the biggest problem and the biggest enemy in the room is apathy. And fear sort of drives us towards apathy. The very nature of ways that we move through systems and structures that like are predicated on criminalizing, surveilling, all of this sort of leads to conditions of like interacting with a condition that doesn't really imagine the past that we've already inherited. And so I think that's something that's really powerful about the way that both of you are alchemizing grief, but also that pre. And that pre is really powerful because it's not something that's lost.
It's something that's present at all points. But certainly when, and I'm going to distort this a little bit, but like the psychic real estate that gets taken up by fear, by grief, by mourning, all legitimate and belongs in the room, cannot be the only feelings in the room. And I think when we then go into the embodied and the affective and the grounded, there's something about how Mishwana Goman says, like, settler grammar of place, like speaking very much about the way that, like, we actually need to discredit the way that place is structured when the legibility of it is through settler rhetoric, to not to reclaim, but to actually center one's orientation to community, to life, to affirm that, to protect that, is in and of itself, and not to romanticize, is the largest enemy to colonial and settler colonial enterprise and regime. So I think it's just, I just want to say thank you for like offering the stories and your thoughts as you're working through these projects and these processes. And um, it's important to also make space for grief in the academic institutions, in these spaces that like performativity of professionalism comes in, and students, faculty, administration have to function through like hiding, masking grief, that somehow this is untethered from reality, when in fact the university is a really beautiful microcosm of the horrors that we encounter at the everyday, but also the beauty. Like the fact that like we get to have spaces like this, the fact that like students are showing us the way in every possible way of being in, yeah, being together differently. I think there's that like that. So yeah, just rambles of thoughts, but I just want to say thank you so much.
I have a question from Jude in the webinar, which I think the previous speaker kind of answered in a really beautiful way, but it'd be great to hear what you guys have to think about it. And Jude asks, or Jude says, thank you both for your inspiring talks. I'm wondering, how do you cultivate psychic militancy in these times? It's so hopeless sometimes. We boycott, fight, etc., but nothing changes.
Hi, thank you. Again, maybe not a question, just some sparks of thought, but I I was thinking through your sort of use of repetition in your talk, Lara, and it was kind of bringing me back to actually a moment when I was reading Ellen Gabriel's "When the Pine Needles Fall," and it was kind of funny because as I was reading through it, and I love Ellen, and Ellen has accomplished so much, but I was like, oh, this is kind of like a bit boring and repetitive because she just keeps coming back to this is not the way that things naturally are, but this is due to the settler colonial state. And I just kept reading, I'm like, oh, like when will this stop? You know? But like at some point my mind shifted and I was like, oh, that's actually what I think maybe she is trying to do in this book, you know? And I think what's also interesting in that is that maintaining that kind of like purity of analysis and truth and understanding has not um necessarily like prevented practical advancements that we might see from a position of sometimes compromise, like going to the UN and all the other things that Ellen has done, you know, and accomplished. Um, but it always keeps coming back to that. And I just thought that was a really uh, interesting thing in terms of just this like militant practice of repetition, you know, to keep us strong. And then the other thing that it made me think of is in Cindy Milstein's collection, Rebellious Morning, and thinking about the women in Fukushima after the Fukushima disaster. And one thing that they mentioned is like feeling like we're already dead, but if we are already dead, then how do we hold on to dignity? And I think that was also a really powerful idea that plays with this idea of, you know, the flickering that you're mentioning. So notions of like dignity within these spaces, and then again how that leads to practical solutions. Dignity was measuring, because the government would do it, was measuring the radioactive whatever Geiger countering all around Fukushima, you know, and that was an act of dignity, and it was actually an act of practically saving lives as well. So yeah, so some connections that we're making. Thank you.
Thank you all. I love the synergy and what's in the space. Um, let me start with online, and then this kind of ties into Anna and Kevin's um, comments for me in my mind. So just as a reminder that this is a practice, what will be doing is a practice of psychic militancy, as Anderson is like naming and acknowledging. Earlier we were talking about how abuse and power sort of expects to work and not be named. Like that's how secrecy. So the settler colony wants to do its violence, and we're not supposed to actually say what is happening, right? That is the expectation, is that we not name that, right? Because somehow naming that, you know, changes how things happen, and I think that's part of it. So just to name for, I think it was Jude online, right? Is a reminder. This is the part the psychic militant is that despair is a commodity too, right? Despair is commodified by settler colonial violence and systems and capitalism and imperialism or any one of these things. Um, and because and this is why I thought about them when you say we do all these things and nothing changed. And what I want to remind you, this is sort of what I've learned from Stephen's work, especially through this, is everything has changed. Everything has changed. And this is not I'm not picking on you to do this, but to say this is the point of the seductions, is that we're like, we feel every single day that nothing is changing, and everything has changed. Gaza changed the world, right? And it is on us to honor the immense price of that. That's not for us to say that there aren't people who we will never get back. Comrades and humans, full humans, right? And to also say that, like, reminding ourselves of that, reminding that when we feel despair, something is happening, is working through us, and is meant to take us off the precondition and to atomize us and make us, you know, to sort of induce amnesia, where like somehow even October 2023, October 1, 2023, that all of us were walking around in kafiyas. The world was not wearing kafiyas. Some of us were wearing kafiyas, right? Again, not a shaming moment, but to say the practice of recognizing the transformations that are happening are actually really important, because settler colonial violence, as Anna was saying, relies on our disconnect, our dismemberment that comes right from, yes, dismemberment as dismembering, but also not remembering, right? Not coming back together and in being in remembrance of sort of like, actually, no, these conditions were very different. I personally could not have seen this sort of like what could emerge that we don't know. On October 8th, 9th, 10th, I could not have imagined the student intifada as it happened. I couldn't. There was no way I could see it like that. The potentials are always there because of like the precondition. I was committed to that. And yet the sort of form it takes and how it happens and how it changes our entire world, it has transformed. And so that reminder to ourselves, the repetition that Kevin, you were sort of, the repetition is so important because it relies on us sort of just being like, and we keep doing, and people keep getting murdered. People keep getting murdered not because we're not doing something, but because the settler colony murders, right? It's like, so that's the return to the if settler colonial states are based on extermination and genocidal process, that's them. There isn't like a settler colonial light, right? That doesn't include genocide. That helps us see that it's not because that is what it's intended to do, which is why those of us fighting for that say we must dismantle settler colonialism, right? Because its intent is to kill. And its intent is to kill based on a hierarchy. And to then make us all feel like we're the ones who are failing. Right? And I think that's the part that to your point, Anna, as I was thinking about, you're sort of bringing into the room, it's so important around when I'm thinking about precondition of what does it mean to have a discipline of attuning to different textures, right? And I think this the Stephen's work inviting us to, again, it's so powerful and also so heartbreaking. Like my heart breaks and expands continuously, right? I think maybe this is also what you're talking to, and being connected to this, and having a different relationship to life and death. That's the process that's always happening, is that to contest the space of just death in the bodies of kids is such a hard thing to do. But when we can do, and this is, Kevin, to your dignity, right? The dignity of life in those limbs. They weren't always dead. They were life and had life potentials. And they deserve that dignity for us to remember that as well. But that takes a psychic attunement to a different texture that doesn't move us away from the inherent tragedy in a settler colonial genocidal state. That's what it does. But it does say there are other forms here, but that takes a practice, so that we're not just saying everything's we're failing constantly. No, there's so much in there.
Seriously, I don't have. I mean, you know, I don't. You said it all, and that was great. And I think that's. I mean, I can't add anything really. I do want to just thank my sib Jude online. I think how do we cultivate militancy or psychic militancy is incredibly important. What we want to do is number one is not deny, as that Lara sort is saying, is we can't deny or belittle suffering and violence. We can't belittle that in the way in which we feel that. The drive towards empathy, apathy, I think again is one that is an intentional effect of violent structures. It pushes us to that, and it's a pushing towards our identification with hegemony, right? And to the start in many ways, again, to sort of play on Lara, is to the start of that psychic militancy is to refuse the hegemony, or the naturalization, if we want to go back to Marx, the demystification, the denaturalization of hegemony. The fact of the matter is like, hey, we live in a fucked up world. We live in a fucked up world when we think all of that shit is fucking true. When we think of the fucked up world, when we think how many fucking prisons are in the United States and why people go to fucking jail and for what. That's a fucked up world. It's a fucked up world where people defend cops for fucking up people for nothing, for selling fucking cigarettes. That's a fucked up world, right? And when we start saying shit like that, we are denaturalizing hegemony. Like, oh, you live in an idealistic world. Well, fuck you. This is the fucking thing with parents too. Like, we raise our I'm so sorry, but we raise our kids to be like, oh, it's a beautiful world. It's in a beautiful world, and no, and then I'll share. And you go into school and you got to share with Sally, and you got to share with Kevin. Share, share, share. Oh, and then dad, then a kid comes and hits you, and like, oh, they hit me, so I punch back. No, you can't punch him back. It's all about. And then somehow you get to middle school and you come back and you're like, oh, Mr. Schmidt, he was really mean to me and humiliated me in front of everybody. He was like, hey, suck it up. You must have done something wrong. It's an unfair world. Like, parents turn into that, right? Somehow in middle school, right? And like, that's messed up. That's the world in which we live in, and that's called hegemony, right? And that is the basis in which we are pushed to apathy, right? And so this, yeah. Well, um, yeah. Um, so, um, so yeah. I mean, I think that's it's also, and so the way in which we cultivate it is also finding this joy, right? And the joy of saying "fuck you" to the world, and we fucking know we're fucking sane, and that there's life affirming, as you said, practices, and how we learn those life. And this is it's not like, again, new age nonsense. It's not life affirming practices because I'm gonna like just breathe well, center myself, do my morning whatever, um, detox. No, it's you look to our revolutionary ancestors and elders. No one was happy in a freaking jail. think about all the people we admire who were in jail or died in jail, right? No one was happy. They were home being like, oh man, I'm so scared to go to jail, and I mean, so many of our heroes and elders and ancestors, and they are the people we look to for inspiration. How do we do it? We look to the Palestinian people. This is the thing, we all get tired. I'm crying like every freaking 30 seconds, right? Like, but if the Palestinian people can do it, who the hell am I to not do it? If the Palestinian people have dignity, right? Have dignity, to remember the Zionist state wants to rip you of your dignity. They want to humiliate you. This is what we see every day, right? Power wants to humiliate you. And the last thing you can have is dignity. And to maintain that dignity. Dignity is a force, and it's the way in which we maintain our militancy, and we maintain our joy, and we maintain our relations with one another, right?
Sorry, I guess I should introduce myself as a diaspora Palestinian, and I'm probably the only person in this room that's not an academic. So, أهلا فيكي, أهلا فيكي. Two questions. So I loved in the beginning when you were talking about, Stephen, when you were talking about grief, because I think we can all share in that. This past year has been a repeat of grief. And for those of us that have always been and were born in the diaspora, it's a grief that we carried with us and that we switched to our children, but we can't actually relate directly to. And what was interesting is when October happened and November, I had colleagues walk up to me and ask me, A, was I okay? And B, do you have any family back there? And when I said I didn't, because I'm actually from Jerusalem, not Gaza, because no one had any idea where I was from, it's just somewhere over there, no offense intended. They turned around and they said, oh, afterwards it was like I was okay. I had to keep reminding people every month, I'm still not okay. It's been a year and a half. I'm pissed as hell. You know what I mean? And I feel guilty and I'm grieving. And why don't you care? You know what I mean? You care about the Ukraine, you care about everybody else. Why aren't you asking me if I'm okay? Now, the other flip of it, Lara, which is what you were talking about, the world has changed. I've seen it even in my own domain, which has nothing to do with psychology or sociology or the humanities. You know, I work in the financial world, which sucks. You know what I mean? Even there, we've seen a change. I see a change every day. Now, what I'm wondering is, psychologically, with the changes that you're talking about, the world has changed. There is an opening. People who never even understood where in the world I was from in the first place, or even cared, are asking me. When they see the kufiya or they see any emblem that I wear, they ask me, they're like, is that a map of Palestine? They didn't even know about Palestine. So there is an opening of opportunity. My wondering is, you're talking about militancy. Militancy in speaking, which we've never seen before. Social media, before it existed, none of us had the guts to open our mouths and say much, except within our own immediate circles. Outside, we had to sort of assimilate to survive, right? So the question is, how can we militarize this opportunity in time through people questioning, through people asking, people seeing the horrors that we're all seeing? Because thankfully, we no longer rely on TV to do that. We're actually seeing it on social media. People are questioning. How can we leverage that to ensure that change continues, that we are changing the narrative? And therefore, we can actually reach the real goal point of where we need to, which is an end to colonial settlerism. Thank you. Thank you. Now I'm really embarrassed.
Anybody else?
Okay. Yeah, hala. I mean, this is part of it. Is I wish we had rooms of less academics. And but here's I think one of the things that you're saying is really important. One is that this is, I think, the contradiction or the conflict of being diasporic, right? And one of the things very early on that we talked about is like settler colonialism, of course, is a genocidal machine, and to always remember that. And also, I think one of the things that this current round of all out unbridled genocide has done is that Nakba is no longer your grandparents' stories. It is real time, which is the if we're talking about attuning to different textures, is what does it mean now that the settler colony has created a situation in which there isn't the separation that it was anymore. It's not just a passing down of stories, it's a current day, which people have been saying for ages. Palestinians have saying the Nakba has not ended, right? And here's settler colonialism's imperiousness, right? Rather than sort of like the settler colony here, sort of bringing it into like truth and reconciliation or sort of acknowledgments, is that now you've created a new generation that is directly connected to their grandparents and great grandparents in terms of experiencing. And that naming of that is actually really important because it unravels the settler colonial myth that somehow there's a time point to this, a temporal piece to this, and also repositions us in this place where we can name that this is exactly the intent, that it didn't end, right? It didn't end in 1948 or in any one of these things. So here's the thing that you're saying, like, how do we militantly engage this moment? Maybe this is back to the question of like, how do we do this on campuses as well, right? Let me say this as bluntly as possible. The compromises didn't work. They didn't work. We're seeing this now with campuses, that the campuses in the context of the settler colony of the United States that bent backwards the most are the ones that are being penalized the most. So us remembering that the compromises that we might have thought, the tactics we might have used at a time when it might have been an honest position to take because we didn't yet know what the full impact of these things were, no longer work. So if this is the moment of like pressure, it's sort of saying, how do we start from the precondition and not compromise even in our language, even how we're saying it, the words that we're using, what we expect, right? We no longer need to settle for crumbs, right? Which also means who's speaking about these things and who's engaging in it, right? Let me use a concrete example. And it's not to pick on this person, but it's to say how well weathered these things are. I was watching a video recently in the context of the United States of a teacher, I believe she's Palestinian, who was talking about, and they were in the local sort of legislature, who were attacking people for teaching this. There was this graphic of my name is Layla, even though they said Lila, right? My name is Layla and my name is Hannah. And Hannah can can go to Palestine even though she's not Palestinian, and Layla can't go there, right? And they go through this graphic, and the person, of course, thinks this is a gotcha moment. Is this correct that you taught this? Are you saying that you know, Hannah can do this, and blaming all of the sort of violence that happens to Layla on Hannah, right? And what the teacher says in response to that is, absolutely correct. She's like, this is exactly anti-Palestinian racism that's happening right now, because what you imagine in Gaza, because he says something like, what would happen to Hannah if she goes to Gaza, right? That's the gotcha moment. And she says, you know, you're sort of asking, this is anti-Palestinian racism, because in asking that, you are sort of walking us into the fact that somehow she'd be killed, right? She didn't say this. But in doing that, she had to engage. This is the seduction back to the students. And like, what would happen is that Hannah would be invited into our homes, and Hannah would play with the children, and Hannah would do this and this and this and this. But what happens if people are fucking angry with Hannah? Not Hannah, the fantasy child, but the IOF soldier that Hannah's a stand-in for, right? Because that's really it. It's playing on our psychic, like, oh, we're supposed to, this is a child. But the people who go into Gaza and murder people are not children. And they don't go in just sort of, you know, throwing out petals. They go in their tanks that fit 10 people that are meant to murder Palestinians, right? And so even engaging in that sort of like, we're not even allowed the anger that we're supposed to, like, No, if Hannah were, and that would be it. What would it be? What would it mean to disrupt that line of questioning with the thing of like, actually, Hannah the child would not be in Gaza. You know who would be in Gaza? The IUF soldiers who are murdering us, right? I'm using that as a way of like, this moment is for us. This is not the compromise moment. We've done all of that. This is the moment for psychic clarity and psychic militancy and reframing and reminding each other, because we start to police each other. Oh, tone yourself down. Don't say this. Don't swear, right? I've been accused of swearing too much and all this. Don't say this. And if we lighten this, if we just like say this a little nicer, none of that works because it's a murderous regime. And you can't argue or tone soften against murderous settler colonial regimes. Right?
I think we should. I just have to say one thing with you, my sister, which is I want to talk to you as a diasporic Arab who I don't know if you live in this settler colony or the one or were raised in the one across the border, but is to root yourself in what you know. And to root yourself in what you said. Oh, we used to talk to one another. Well, the whole world is one another. This room is one another. I want us all to leave. I don't want us to be like, wow, that's really great, but now what? No, I want you to go like, okay, everything that I was fucking thinking is true. Everything that I was thinking is true. They're not going to stop us. And I want you to know that, like, everything that you knew and didn't say outside because you were compelled through racial force to silence yourself is now out. And to how to militarize is to never compromise what you know to be true. That's where you are now. There's no convincing. You said change the narrative. There is no narrative to change. You know the narrative. We all know the narrative. We all know the narrative. There is no narrative. There is no other narrative. Genocide is genocide. Nekba, settler colonialism. We know the narrative. So I just want you, my sister, I'm not talking to you as an academic, I'm talking to you as a sister in diaspora, to root yourself and all of you, those you love in the moment, in all that you know to be true.
Thank everyone in this room for being here. I want to thank Lara and Stephen for just, my God, like bringing everything you have. And I again want to just, can we give them one more round of applause? All right, so we will say goodbye to those online. So thank you for joining us online as well. And again, thank you to Lara and Stephen. And please be well, and may we remain in community beyond the semester, beyond and beyond. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Oh, amazing.